welcome to the University of Bath's version of Question Time. My name is Georgina Brown. I'm the New Equality and Diversity Manager here at the University of Bath, and I'm going to be your chair this afternoon. I think we need to start on the first topic, which is we're going to look at breaking free of labels. So has anyone got any questions which they'd like to ask? Come on, there must be some out there. I know there's one out there. Carol.
This was a discussion that came up in our session before, and it's about the label that comes with your physical appearance. I'd be very much like to hear from the panel as to how to tackle that if you're the one being labelled, and tackle that if you think you see someone about to label in whatever way.
Okay, so basically how we tackle labelling based on appearance and how we call that out and how we handle it as an individual. Who would like to start on that? Dawn, would you like to?
Yes, I can do. My perspective on labels comes from my work in engineering, because I think what happens often in engineering is engineers like to, because it's a very traditionally male domain, people like to consider themselves as an engineer and not as a woman. And I think it's very difficult for women to stand up for themselves as being a woman in engineering. And I think that causes quite a lot of conflict, because we find that it's often very hard for, it came up earlier actually, and I think if you say to a woman in engineering, you said it in fact on the video, you don't want to be seen as a female scientist. But that's quite damaging for the profession really, because that continues to reinforce the bias that scientists and engineers are men. And sometimes I think it's quite good to take on the label of being a woman. And you will often see women engineers and scientists saying, I don't want to be thought of as a woman, I just want to be thought of as an engineer.
I suppose I feel it really would depend on the context, because I'm not somebody who shies away from labels. I think they're actually quite useful. So, for example, if somebody came in here and said, I'm looking for a woman, it'd be very easy just to say, was she black? And then if the answer is no, you can rule myself and Rennie out, and we can actually get to the person who they're looking for a lot quicker. So I think if it's a descriptor in that sense, it's actually very useful. And labels, I think, also are a sense of pride. I'm proud to be black. I'm proud to be a woman. So there are times when that will be relevant, and my voice will need to be heard for particular reasons, or people will seek out my opinions for that. So I don't think it's necessarily always a bad thing. I think when it gets into a situation where it does need to be called out, it's important for people to be allies. And so it's not just the black people who are saying it. It's not just the women who are saying it. It's also people using their own privilege to put the spotlight on people without putting the burden on them as well.
So how would you say we craft a culture to make that possible, that people are able to call people out?
I think from my own research with black students here, I think it's also about creating a culture that makes it safe. So actually getting everybody on the same page. So for example, we can have very sophisticated conversations about identity, which are important. But if there are students who are coming here saying, I actually don't know if it's okay to use the word black, I don't actually know if it's okay to use the word Pakistani, I don't know what to say. It's really important to raise that bar of a minimum of saying, here are the things that are okay, here are the things that aren't. That way you aren't putting the burden of responsibility of educating on the people who are often on the receiving end of ignorance, essentially. So I think just getting everybody on the same page where these are the textbook things we can say categorically, these are okay. Please don't step outside of that. That's really helpful for people who don't have to then do it themselves.
I mean, I, as a Muslim, have been labelled over the years with many labels that I haven't been proud of, or because they were quite derogatory. I just think that when the word Muslim is seen in the media, it's associated with labels such as terrorism. So terrorist, a Muslim is immediately equated with that word. And what I personally have had to face over the years is to try and explain, and in fact explain why. Why should I have to explain for the events that take place around the world? Why am I immediately associated with that type of label? And that's the discussion I think we need to have. It's like it's made out to be that label immediately suggests that I'm the one who needs to solve the problem, and it's like my problem. Francesca sort of highlighted that very beautifully, that we do need to understand our society and what's going on and why we get labelled. And I actually felt she was speaking on behalf of me when as a Muslim, I felt, she was doing my talking, and I almost felt that it was easier for her to talk on behalf of me than me doing it for myself, because I'm immediately physically seen as a person. Why would she? She's bound to say that.
My take on it is we do need labels, whether they are on appearance or anything else, because it helps us navigate society. I know as a queer person, within LGBT+, the plus is there because there are so many different labels that can be used, and it helps people almost define who they are within themselves, because you can see that other people have a similar identity of you. There's that sense of solidarity that you can create by using labels. But the main issue with labels is the intent behind them. So, for example, Nottingham Trent last week, there was an example of the word black being used in a very negative and derogatory way by students, and that should be called out. But that's not saying that the label black is necessarily negative and should be called out in every instance. So really it should be changing the culture to allow people to call out racism, sexism when those labels are used in that way, but not necessarily banning them outright.
So we encourage students that fall into those categories to almost stand up, be heard, represent their groups, work with us and university to solve any issues they have and make their experience of living in Bath, of their 3+ years of a degree.
At the same time, we have to be careful that the people, when they are hired or when they are given a place at the university, that they don't feel that it is just to fill up a quota. So if I'm an engineer and I'm a woman, I don't want to be hired because I'm a woman and more women are needed so that the university or a workplace gets a tick.
Yeah.
I want to be hired for what I can provide. So it's a very delicate balance where we want to give equality, but also to hire the people that are right for the job so that they can feel proud for being hired.
Exactly.
Can I just say
Yeah, of
something
course.
in response to that? What often happens, what you often hear is people saying, well, of course we want to hire the best person for the... No, we want to have more women, but we want to have the best person for the job. As if they're two things that aren't, that don't, that, for some reason that they... Just because you're saying we want to hire the best person somehow means that you shouldn't hire a woman. I hear those two phrases put together all of the time, and I think we've got to call that out when we hear that, because they don't go together. And educate people, I think, when they're creating the job descriptions, to say, actually, is your job kind of male-shaped? Because if it is, you're always going to get a man who looks as if they're filling that job description better. So there are, multiple ways that you can describe the same job, and some of the time they will appeal more to women, and sometimes they'll appeal more to men, depending on the language you use. And you should be able to have both of those descriptions so that the job appeals to both genders, really.
So how exactly would you address the issue where you find yourself being labelled negatively by authority figures or those who have a kind of position of power over you, such as, for example, lecturers?
Good question. Who would like to take that?
I think once you've found yourself in that position, if there's anybody who you think in the university, even if they're not in that department or connected to you, if you can find people who you personally feel like have a sustained interest. Like people in this room, for example, now have shown themselves to have an interest in equality and diversity and stand for it to some extent. And so I think I would take it through that channel, because you don't obviously want to put yourself in a difficult position, but you also want it to be called out, right, I'd imagine. And so I think going through different departments, so now we have George, someone like that, to say, look, this has happened, I'm not absolutely sure, and I don't know, and I don't think you should take on the burden of responsibility as an individual, is essentially what I'm saying. So I think that you should try to find people who, there are safety in numbers a lot of the time, and the right people are in place to help you to be able to do that, because I absolutely don't think it should be on one student to try and change somebody in a position of power. That's not their job. And so I think finding somebody who you can trust and finding somebody who has the right connections and the right channels would be my personal advice.
I think there's two routes that you can go down. I think if you find that it's something, if you feel that it's something major, then you've had some really good advice of ways to deal with that. But some of the work that I do is around micro inequalities and how to deal with the kind of smaller things that you perhaps would feel weren't enough to report and seem trivial at the time, but they kind of add up to a toxic whole, if you like, when they happen all the time, and they're constant negative, small negative things. So there's some really good training and it's all about having strategies and tools to deal with that. And there's some really good active bystander training. I don't know, maybe you've already had it here from Imperial College. It's around the 4 Ds. Is that something that you've come across before?
No.
So it's the 4 Ds are direct, so you can challenge someone directly if you feel that you're in the right environment. Maybe if it's a small environment, you can say something directly to that person at the time. It can be delayed action, so you can think, okay, well, I didn't like that, so I'm going to go away and maybe email them later or have a word with them outside the room. There's deferred, so you can go to somebody else. Maybe if it's in a meeting, you can go to the chair of the meeting and say, look, this has happened, and I want you to pick it up subsequently so that I'm not being the victim and being the one saying, this against me. And the other one is distraction, which I've not quite got the hang of yet, but distractions around conflict. So if there's conflict going on, then you can distract from the conflict and kind of move a situation on. And they are really good tools, and there are a number of different tools and strategies that you can use. And some of them are based around transactional analysis and how you get effective communication with someone, so that when you make a complaint or when you tell them something that is affecting you, how they take that on board and how that becomes an effective communication with them. And I think there are strategies that we can all use. And I personally have pledged in the past year to say something whenever I see something that I feel is a micro inequality. And it gives you such a sense of empowerment just because you have decided that you're going to do something, even if you can't get that person to change, which oftentimes you can't. But it makes you feel as if you've done something about it.
How can we ensure that the leadership is aware of the importance of equality and diversity, and that it is a fundamental part of every decision rather than a bolt-on? And secondly, how can we, the staff, call out the lack of diversity and understanding within the VCG and governing bodies and demonstrate the obvious impact it is having?
Thank you, Abby. Does anyone want to start on that question?
An example goes back a long time ago when it was a school that they actually wanted to do. It was almost 95% Muslim, that school, and the school actually wanted to do some social activity for these children, and then the school decided they're going to have a Bhangra disco. Now, 95% of those students were Muslims, and these were Muslim girls, and they didn't do Bhangra. But that was the lack of knowledge and understanding on the parts of the school management, that just because they happen to be Asian doesn't mean that they all do Bhangra. So they just needed to understand that there are differences, and that, I think, is what we need to sort of equip people with.
You need to have a real in-depth knowledge, whether that be through conversations or meeting people or actually mixing up the staff and student body so you actually do get that interaction rather than just sticking into cliques that naturally form?
I think in terms of leadership, some of the things that I've found to be successful in my previous role as an equality and diversity trainer, I don't think it's a case of people in senior management positions not understanding that equality and diversity is important. It's more, why is it important to me? How is it going to benefit me and the business and what I'm trying to achieve? And so usually there is a moral case and a business case, and it's about efficiency. It's really about selling the idea that having a much more diverse workforce, student body, it's only ever going to add to your efficiency, whether it is about money or whether it is about the ideas and the learning and student voice and student representation and having higher student satisfaction, things like that. And it's unfortunate that it has to be sold that way, but sometimes there is a bottom line, and I think that's much more efficient in terms of getting people to be beacons of change, as opposed to saying, well, what can we quickly do just to say that we did it? It's more about long-lasting change, and it's about cultural change, and that can only ever be a positive thing for a university, any university, and I think those are the types of things that have worked for senior leaders, in my experience.
Some companies, for example, have diversity impact analysis. So everything they do has to go through a diversity impact analysis, and it has to be scrutinised from that diversity perspective. So that is just a bias interrupter, if you like. So you know maybe that you don't have the diversity in the room, but you know for whatever reason that it's a business imperative, or you've got a moral reason for doing that. So you can put that bias interrupter in place to make sure that the outcomes are the ones you want.